Yes, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. My name is Lisa Paddock. I'm one of the assistant directors at InSource and the central team leader. And today you have joined office hours with IDOE and InSource, and we are so happy that you've joined us. And so this meeting is being recorded and will be put up on our YouTube channel very shortly. So please make sure that you also share this information. And InSource is your parent training center for Indiana, and we help families understand that special education process and work together with their schools. So without any further ado, I will introduce to us Brandon Myers. He's a data specialist at IDOE, and I had an opportunity to work with him for many years. He does an excellent job in all things data. So today he is going to talk with us about child count and what that looks like and what it actually means. So welcome, Brandon. Welcome everyone here today on office hours. And I'll turn it over to you, Brandon. Thank you.
Thanks, Lisa. If you need to interrupt me, just go right ahead, because I can't really see anything other than the presentation right now. So if you need to break in or anything, just feel free.
I will be watching questions in the chat and let you know if there are any. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Welcome, everybody. Yes, we're going to talk about the child count today. And this is the first time I've done this particular presentation with InSource, so I hope you'll bear with me, but I'm trying to present this information in a way that is comprehensive, but also not get into so much detail like we would with the schools on some of the finer points. But if you have questions about any of that, I'm happy to answer that. Any of those. We're going to talk basically three different sections today. The child count basics, what we use it for, and then I hope the most exciting part of the presentation, which is actually look at some of our data statewide and try to give you a portrait of what special education looks like from 5,000 or 10,000 feet in Indiana, which is how we have to make our decisions here at the Department of Ed. And, you know, for those of you who are parents of children in the count, your child is one of the almost 200,000 kids with disabilities. So we're both focused at the department looking at your kids' specific situations, but also seeing them as part of the system in Indiana at the state level, the school level, and down to the classroom level. So the basics of the child count is, and why it's called the child count is even though it's not only children in it, is that is the name that's given to it by the federal government and goes back now almost 50 years since the creation of IDEA in its first form in 1975. So IDEA requires an annual count of children with disabilities every year. The date that IDEA sets leaves it up to the states, but it has to be between October 1st and December 1st. And Indiana code sets the date as December 1st. So this year, December 1st is on a Sunday, so technically count day is December 2nd, but it's the same principle. We have an additional Indiana mandated count every April 1st. However, we're not going to really be talking about data from that count today. I can talk about what the April 1st count is used for. It's basically just monitoring of the numbers. It currently at present is not used for any funding or any official monitoring activity. We do report it to the state board and the state budget agency. But it's the December 1 count that is the federally mandated one and is the one also that matters for most state activities. So children ages 3 to 22, obviously 18 to 22-year-olds are not legally children, but and so sometimes you'll see the term youth used, but the child count is the old-fashioned term, so we'll stick with children. And in Indiana, we're counting children who are right now under one of 4 categories. So the first 2 of these are the federally required categories. Those are students on IEPs. So that's public school are providing the services, including charter schools, and service plans, which are students at non-public schools, but who are receiving services from the traditional public school corporation. That's most of our children in non-public schools receiving special education, but not all of them. And obviously the charter schools, even though they are public schools, do not have responsibilities to provide services for children at non-public schools. So those are the federally required ones. And then we have the 2 additional state add-ons. So we have to count these kids for some federal purposes. They are not formally part of the federal child count, but they're part of our child count. So I've included them here. We have the Choice Special Education Plan, or CSEP. That's where children are getting services provided at the non-public choice school where they qualify for the choice voucher. It's up to the choice school if they want to provide special education services, and further, it's up to the parent, as some of you may know, if they would like the public school to provide or the non-public school. That's up to both the non-public school and the parent. That number has been growing kind of steadily, but it's still a small minority of the students at non-public schools receiving services. Most of them are receiving them from the public school corporation. And then we have the newer program, which is the Education Savings Account Service Plan. It is mirrored in structure the way the Choice Special Education Plan, although of course, instead of being under the responsibility of the private school or non-public school, as we would call it, it's under the responsibility of the parent to manage those funds through approved providers, and that is done through the state treasurer. So we get that data from the state treasurer, and they do form part of our state child count if the parents have selected themselves to manage those services. But it's out of a different budget. We'll talk about that in a little bit. So that has also been growing. It's newer, so the growth rate is faster than the Choice Special Education Plan. And we can talk a little bit about what those numbers look like. They're still pretty small compared to our overall population. Okay, so what kind of information are we getting? We're not just counting each child and adding it all up and getting, this number approaching 200,000. There's a lot more data in this. They're used for various purposes that we will cover. We have the child school, the disability categories, primary and secondary. That's important for fiscal purposes, as we'll talk about. Their education environment, we also sometimes call that as LRE. So what is their school day looking like? Are they in educational experiences with non-disabled peers, or are they isolated? Specialized settings, where this is important because sometimes children are placed at a facility or a school where there's restrictions on what their placement can look like. So if you have Department of Children's Services or a judge, sometimes alternative to incarceration, that would include actually a local incarceration at a juvenile detention facility. So obviously, sometimes medical treatment, psychiatric treatment, other kinds of medical treatment, and obviously that limits the options of the case conference committee in terms of where that child can get their education. So we try to collect that data as well. And then, of course, the dates that they are receiving services, so we know when they're active. Now, when we talk about our child count data, it's not only that. So we have a lot of monitoring to do based over lots of different factors. As you may know, there's 18 federal indicators on the state performance plan, annual performance report. We'll talk a little bit about that later. So there's a lot of data that is needed for lots of different purposes. So when I talk about what the child count actually means, I'm not only talking about the data we're collecting next week, but also the kind of pre-existing data or other program data that we have to kind of make that data set that we're going to be using on a regular basis. So obviously, basically, the most important of those are the demographic information. So the child's birth date, we can know their age. That has lots of fiscal and monitoring consequences. Their race, ethnicity, sex, free reduced lunch status, the corporation of legal settlement, because in Indiana now we have a large population of children who are not being educated by the public school corporation where they live. Either they're in a charter school, non-public school, or they're actually more common going to a neighboring school district from where they live. And then we add others. So we can, because we have state ID numbers for each child, we can look at this data in lots of different ways. We can look at both our children that are both English language learners and special education, who are both eligible for migrant education, who are homeless, if we have the need. That isn't what I would call the basic child count data, but we can always go further if needed. Some of the, especially with some of our initiatives and things like that. Okay, so how does this happen? This is the kind of technical part, the part that may not interest as many of you, but I did want to include how this works, because we have in Indiana 425 school systems across the state. That includes 290 traditional public school corporations, and then the rest are mostly charter schools for public. And then we have a lot of choice non-public schools as well that are sending us data. So that is a lot. And then, so that's like, it's almost 2,000 schools, individual schools in several hundred school systems. So that is a lot of information that is flowing from the local level to the state level. And it is, so we need a very sophisticated system to be able to collect all this data. And we have kind of modernized lately. I work with one of my colleagues, Robin Parker, who started when they introduced the first computer collection of this data back in the 1980s. And she actually drove around the state collecting this data. We have a lot more data coming in now, and we have a lot more validations and so forth. So we have, it's quite a system to look at. The data exchange is where we get this from. It's a central hub where all school systems, student data systems. So sometimes you may have your child, you may be logging into Power School or Harmony to see your child's grades or communications from teachers, depending on how they have that set up. All of those systems are connected by the IT people in the information technologies world, and that data is constantly now flowing to IDOE. So there's a lot of data coming in, and we're looking for the snapshot of what is happening on December 1st to comply with federal and state law to get our count, but then also all the data that goes along with that count. So I obviously am concerned with special education, but title programs, Title I, the various Title IV programs, Title III, this is all data that's coming in, state data for your ADM, the average daily membership, basic tuition support. All this data is coming in through this system. So you're talking about millions and millions and millions of records because we have about 1.1 million students enrolled in reporting districts across the state, both probably closer to 1.2 million if you count the non-public. So how does this work? It all flows in, and I'm going to just focus on the special education December 1 count, the child count. It comes in, it sits in this central hub, and then it's validated. We have lots of different ways to see, is this data correct? both are there conflicts with other schools, but other things as well. So obviously, children are constantly moving, and it becomes a really big deal when they're moving around these count days, which are the snapshot days. So October 1st for tuition support, December 1st for special education. And we have to look to make sure that not more than one school is reporting a child. And so that is a process that the schools, in the old days, they could only do this at the time of reporting. And by old days, I mean like 4 years ago, which seems like old days at sometimes, and it seems like yesterday in other ways. So you are putting in your data, and then it's being compared constantly. So schools can log in at any time and see when they have conflicts. Obviously, when we get around this December 1st date is when it's imperative that those conflicts are cleaned up so that every single child is counted and counted only once. We're also looking at things, does the data fit? So if they're reporting an educational environment, we have preschool settings and we have school settings. Is the child's age and grade matching with that code? So there's those types of validations going on as well, and things that the schools, messages that the schools get, which they can then clean up. We have to make sure that we identify those children that are receiving services who are enrolled in non-public schools, and that includes homeschools in Indiana. And then we're looking at various data quality issues. So we're trying to do a better job of catching some of this with more displays available and follow-ups. It's difficult, I will say, when we have 2 special education data staff specifically. We have other supports within the department, but for all these 200,000 students, we can't catch everything. But one of the things that is very important is when you have a large change in a school district. So we want to flag that and figure out, was there a data error last year, or is there a data error this year, or is there just that large change? Like you'll see some of our virtual schools have just tremendous growth, have experienced tremendous growth in their count. So that doesn't surprise us as much, although we want to make sure we nail down all those students. But you'll also see situations where a school will drop off, and it's somehow they had something in their student information system that it wasn't sending pre-kindergarten. We've had that in the past. Or some other kinds of mistakes where they didn't resolve their validations, and that has serious fiscal consequences for some of our LEAs. So and we can make those corrections after the fact, but we don't prefer to do that. We want to get this all certified and cleared by really the end of January, and even by Christmas, really most, and kind of just be dealing with the outliers before that. So that's how we validate the data and end up with each student being a line in our data set with all that information, and then we take that information to use for whatever purpose that we're looking at. So that is going to bring us into our child count uses. So I just want to pause for a second. Does anybody have any questions? Feel lost? Comments before we go on to the next section?
Brandon, I don't see anything in the chat. If anyone has anything, please make sure that you put it there, and I will be sure that it gets asked of Brandon.
Okay, so thanks. So we'll talk about what we use this for, which is probably more interesting than the kind of details of why we have to do it and how we do it. This data, the data sets that we can collect based off of this information, is used really for 3 major purposes. The first one is state and federal reporting. So there are reports of counts, disaggregated in various different ways, that have to be reported to both various Indiana agencies and also to the United States Department of Education. Then we have the kind of big headline section, which is fiscal, because it does have very large amounts of money that are being allocated based off of this data. And then finally, which is probably takes the most time for our office is the monitoring that we're required to do under mostly federal law. Although we do have some state monitoring as well, but mostly our federal responsibilities to monitor each of those 425 school systems. And I'll explain a little bit how this data helps us do that. So let's start out with fiscal. The child count provides data for the adjusted pupil count, which is our kind of population that has reached kindergarten eligibility, and our state education preschool count, which are those children who have not yet reached kindergarten eligibility. And those of you who have young children or remember this, kindergarten eligibility date is August 1st. Now, that doesn't mean you can't start if you're younger than that, and it doesn't mean you have to go to kindergarten at that age. But that's how we divide these two sections of the count, is by whether or not that child has reached that age. So these two funds are what funds the state portion of our Indiana special education dollars. Now, these are unrestricted dollars, so the schools can spend this how they would like, but most of it is going to be spent on special education, and they have to spend a certain amount of state and local money on special education every year as a condition of federal law. So that is something our fiscal office does. So if you ever ask schools about this, I just want to be clear that this is money that is supposed to be added to tuition support to help schools provide special education services, but it's not the only money that necessarily has to be spent to do that. Okay, so how is that determined? And that's determined in Indiana statute, how much per student is paid. And that's the structure that we have for the state dollars, is a per student amount. And those of you who know about the ESA and the Choice Scholarship Education Plan, or now it's called Choice Special Education Plan, those are locked in at these amounts as well. So it's good to know these amounts, but it's also important to know that it does not mean that it takes this much money to educate a child with a special needs situation. It can be more than this for that particular child. It can be less than this. This is just an amount that is set sort of as an average to supplement that tuition support. Once again, when we talk data, we're talking about the state at 5,000 feet. And it's easy to forget that every single child has individual needs that have to be met, regardless of how much money is being generated at the state and federal level. So I want to underline that just as I go through that, is that these amounts don't mean that that is the amount that's being spent to educate your child. It's targeted so that there will be enough money to educate all the children, but each child has an individual guarantee. So we have our levels. A couple of years ago, the state legislature broke the levels up from levels 1, 2, and 3. They broke up 1 and 2 into 2 different subsections, but they did not change the amount. The amounts are the same for each subsection, at least so far. So you'll see level 1, this is the primary disability for multiple disabilities, orthopedic impairment, emotional disability when it requires full-time need, severe intellectual disability, autism, and traumatic brain injury. And then the other section, which is funded at the same level but has been broken out, are our sensory loss areas of blind or low vision, deaf, hard of hearing, and deaf blind. Those under Indiana law are considered severe disabilities, mainly just for fiscal purposes. That's why we call them that. The mild and moderate disabilities, also a fiscal category. Once again, that was also broken out, but as you can see, the amounts are the same. So that's specific learning disability, developmental delay, and I'll get into developmental delay in a second. It only goes up to age 8 and then other health impairment. And then our final category is emotional disability, mild, moderate, for APC level 2.2. Then we have communication disorders, which is language or speech impairment. And that's important to know that it's a little different. That money is, if the child only has that, that is $551 that's generated by the school. But if the child has that as a secondary disability, has one of these others above, and that, then that 551 is added on. That's the only one that's like that. So that's the only time secondary disability matters, is in that fiscal context. Our preschool children, those who have not received yet, reached kindergarten eligibility age, even if they've started kindergarten, that's 3,820. That is across the board, no matter what disability combination that they have. So that structure has always been different. We had for 20, I think it was 27 years, we had no increase in that. And it's gone in the last 6 years from $2,700 about to this now $3,820. So the legislature has increased that quite a bit in percentage terms. For federal fiscal, we use this to help calculate our grants, but it's not a per student amount when you talk about federal funding. It's a rather complex formula that involves the child count that we just talked about, a school's overall enrollment, as well as its poverty rate. And we're also doing for this one proportionate share. So this is important if any of you watching have children that are children with disabilities that you're either homeschooling or are in a non-public school, private school. At the federal level, we have to specifically account for the money spent on these children as a portion of the total amount. So we're getting that from this child count because we can tell, as I mentioned earlier, whether from the data, whether or not your child is being educated in a non-public school. So that is very important that that data is accurate so that we're making sure that that money is being spent properly. Okay, we also have our monitoring activities. And as I said, this takes up the most time for our staff, is what we do with this data for monitoring. And Lisa, have we had sessions on the SPP APR in the past?
Yes, we have on different venues. I don't know how many individuals who are here have attended them.
Right.
We've also shared out opportunities to be on work groups about it.
Great, great. So I'm not going to get into a lot of detail because we're talking about the count, but that is our big report that is due every February 1st to the U.S. Department of Education. And so it has lots of different special education information, although it doesn't have everything. And we have our indicators 5 and 6. I'm going to show data on that on the education environment, but it also has indicator 9 and 10, which is about disproportionality. And that all is coming from data from this child count. It also is affecting indicator 3, which is our state assessment data. So iLearn, SAT, IM. iRead isn't in there, but this applies to that because we have to identify which of these children taking this test has a disability. So we get that from the child count. Our parent survey data, when we need to know what our response rate is, we turn to our child count, and then also our transition goals, which is indicator 13. This data also goes into the annual determination that is required for IDEA of each school system. So each one of those 425 school system gets either meets requirements, needs assistance, or needs intervention every single year. And there's data from this child count that makes up the scoring for that as well. We also use it for our strategic initiatives. So things that are funded out of our Part B grant, we use it to help decide what areas to focus on. Mostly we're focusing on stuff that has to do with para grants right now, developing special education administrators. When we have a program that we're looking at those types of things, we're looking at the child count data to try to figure out where to target those things. And then finally, we have factors to determine our general and specialized monitoring. So the IDEA requires that we look deeper at each district at least once every 6 years. And that's still a lot of districts. That's, you think about the 425 over 6 years is about 70 a year. So how we do that, we need to prioritize which districts to look at the closest in a more intense way. And we're using child count and other data to do that. Okay, now comes for the fun part, which is our child counts and trends. All right, so this is the actual data that gives you a sense of what special education looks like in Indiana. So as I mentioned, we have these two major portions of the count, which is the school age population and the preschool. Those are divided up for various reasons, both legal and practical. And we have about, as I said, 1.1 million students in the state enrolled. And you'll see the percentages for how many of those children are with disabilities in a little bit. Our APC count last year was 180,315. So that would include any child that was receiving services through one of those four categories of CSEP, ESA, and then the big one, IEP, and the next biggest one, service plan. That is at the APC school age level. And at the preschool level, we have 14,554, those children who had not yet reached kindergarten eligibility. We call it 5A because they're 5 on December 1st, but it depends whether they reach kindergarten eligibility as to which of these counts they're in, 5A or 5B. Okay, so the history of the child count, it has been going up, and you'll see that reflected in our identification rate fairly steadily. We had slow rates of increase. This goes back 10 years. We had slow rates of increase in the period when I started in 2016, and we started to see a little bit of an increase. You see the flattening year. That was the year of, that was our big COVID year, was the disruption for COVID, and it flattened out as we didn't see as many children identified, and also we saw our enrollment go down by a lot in that particular year, and it's been recovering since. The special education numbers since then have been increasing at a faster rate since COVID, which a lot of people predicted, and it hasn't slowed down yet. We'll see what happens this year. All right, what is the profile? So when you think about special education, you can't really think about it as one monolithic thing. We have, each child has their individual needs. And then if you categorize those children by primary disability category, you're kind of seeing the lay of the kinds of programs that schools are having to develop. So our largest category is specific learning disability. And this area shows you here kind of how it's fitting in to the whole picture. It's a little less now, but it was like about a third of our kids were specific learning disability. Language and speech is our second, and other health impairment is the third. And we'll look at the growth of that here in a second. Then autism spectrum disorder, mild intellectual disability, our emotional disability categories. You kind of need to combine these in a way, but I wanted to keep them separate because it does show those students who are needing full-time services and those that are needing part-time. And then developmental delay. And then we start to get into what we would call our lower incidence disabilities. Moderate and severe intellectual, multiple, and the sensory loss ones, as well as orthopedic impairment and TBI. So hopefully this gives you a kind of a graphical representation of how many students out of that total 180 some thousand are fitting into these categories and dictating how schools manage their resources. Okay, how has that been changing? This is the big change that we have seen over the last 10 years, is that other health impairment continues to, I would say, have not quite skyrocketing, but whatever is below that, rates of growth across the state. You see, we have broken over 30,000 students that now are in the other health impairment category. Our other high growth area has been autism spectrum disorder. At times that has been actually the higher rate because it starts from a lower base. So those are our two areas that have seen the most growth. You notice, as I kind of mentioned earlier, that specific learning disability has gone down a little bit. A lot of that has to do with a legal change. It's actually, I think, pretty steady, but legally we introduced developmental delay into this population. The legislature did in 2018. So prior to that, the developmental delay was only for the preschool children. But now that has gone in. So I think what we saw was developmental delay obviously started from nothing and then went way up very fast. And a lot of those children were children who were changed to specific learning disability earlier, or they were de-identified altogether and then maybe showed up in specific learning disability, which was why the age was extended. But there is always going to be a cap at this because DD can only go up to age 8. And as you can see, we had this high growth, but now it's kind of leveling out. One of the interesting things about this as well is emotional disabilities has really stayed pretty steady. A lot of people were predicting that would increase after COVID, and maybe that's a delayed effect. We have seen that in some local districts, but overall, it's actually been pretty steady. It's other health impairment where we're seeing the massive growth and the growth rate returning to where it was after COVID. Okay, so let's go to the preschool count. Our preschool count is a little more dramatic, the graph, because the COVID effects were much greater as a percentage. The year that COVID hit, we saw just a drop off in the number of children in this age group that were being evaluated, which you can understand. A lot of parents were not wanting to bring their child in for evaluation under the circumstances. So we had this actual decrease. These numbers obviously are a lot smaller than our school age population. So the decrease looks very dramatic. It was about 1,500 kids. That's a lot in 1 year for the preschool population. So as you can see, it has recovered and is now kind of back on its sort of increasing rate that it was before COVID. That COVID thing is important though, because that means there were a lot of kids in here that are now 6, 7, 8, who were not as identified as early as they would have been if we hadn't have had the COVID disruption. So that is an important thing that we're still and the schools are very aware of, is that there are children who weren't getting services quite as early as they should have been, really, because of the dislocations that we saw for COVID. This preschool population is way different when you look at the disability category. So developmental delay and language and speech dominate, and autism is a significant minority. Other health impairment is growing. It didn't used to be nearly as big in this population. It is growing. And then we have the rest. So obviously what's missing here, you can't even see it, is specific learning disability. Because the kinds of evaluations we do for specific learning disability, you don't usually see that showing up until the earlier elementary years, although there are a few. So that's the massive difference when you look at this from school perspective. As parents, your schools are having to program their preschool completely different. They have children with a different set of needs at that stage. Will a lot of these children in developmental delay probably eventually end up identified with a specific learning disability? Yes, so there is that continuity. Okay, so I've been mentioning the increased numbers, and our state enrollment has been growing at a slower rate and actually decreased after we had a large decrease in the number of children just enrolled after COVID that has been recovering, but our special ed recovered a lot faster. And as you can see, there's different ways to calculate this. So depending on what method you're using, sometimes this will be a little higher, sometimes a little bit lower. We are not particularly high for identification rate. When you look at the federal, all 50 states, but there are certain school districts that have very high identification rates, and we do look at that. So it's important to look at this both at the local level and at the state level. So we're now, for last year, at around 16.5% of our children enrolled identified. At the preschool level, you have to be careful how you calculate this, because it's a much higher percentage of children in our public schools in preschool have a disability, which makes sense. A lot of kids without disabilities are not being served by the public school at that age. But so we do control for that. And that's why this number in some other methodologies can be a little higher. But we are seeing more children as a share, and it's been steady, every single year, more children with disabilities than we had before. Okay, then the last thing I want to talk about is, where are your kids in the school? What kind of environments are they in? And I tried to make this as readable as possible without losing too much information. So in Indiana, we have high rates of inclusion compared to nationally. So last year we had 78% of our kids that were in the regular classroom, 80% of the day or more. So we've really started to talk at the department about what kind of supports those children are getting in the regular education setting, because so many of them are in our general education classrooms. You also have to consider that parental decision takes out 4%. So in a way, it's even higher than that, because these are the children that are on service plans in private schools. And then you see our other categories, which are those children in resource rooms and separate, which means they're kind of mixed between the general class and a resource room setting, and then the separate class being about 8%. So that's together is about 16%. And then the others are really small. Our homebound population, students in a separate day school, residential, and correctional, obviously being the smallest. And then at the preschool level, we look at this a little bit differently because preschool settings are so different from kindergarten and up. And so we look at the whole experience, whether or not the child could be in a community-based preschool and getting their special ed services at the public school. We look at all of that. So children that are in a regular early childhood program, and that's defined as including daycare, any setting where there's a mix between children and those children that have not been identified with a disability. So together, that makes up about 44%. Within means they're receiving services with those children present. Without means they're being pulled out for most of those services into a different classroom or into a different part of the classroom. We still have about 38% of our children that are in special education preschools. Those are children only with disabilities. Obviously, this varies from district to district, so you may be interested in that kind of data that is available on our website. And then this provider location are mostly those kids that are just coming in for speech services. But we think this number is probably a little too high because a lot of those kids are also in a regular early childhood program. So we've been trying to get a little better data on that. And then we have our private and home services as well. So hopefully that all gives you a portrait of what the child count is about, why we do it, how exciting it can be. the details are not exciting, but when you see what it's used for, December 1st is our sort of special ed holiday when it comes to state administration. It's the most important day of the year because it's when we get most of our data. Now, this isn't all of the special education data that we get. We have our evaluation data for students that are initially evaluated for a disability and those timelines that are so important. We have all kinds of other assessment data from our different programs, personnel data. So this is, in terms of the totality of data, a minority, but it definitely is the most important data that we work with and the most frequent on a day-to-day basis at IDOE. So I thank everyone for their attention, and I'm happy to take any questions, comments, suggestions, criticism. I can take it all.
Brandon, thank you so much for joining us today. It was very helpful and very informative, and I know everyone appreciated it. Does anyone, if you have a question, you're welcome to unmute yourself and ask it. Also here we do see the email addresses if you have questions, specialeducation@doe.in.gov and oscdata@doe.in.gov. And it is very interesting, whether you're a parent or you work at a PTI, to understand some of the intricacies of the funding and the child count.
I should have mentioned that our federal funding is about 280, maybe close to 300 million now.
Okay.
So so when you put that together, that's over $1 billion per year being generated to go to Indiana schools. But as I said, that doesn't always match the expenditures because that gets into the details of how you account for that and so forth. But that's how much money is being sent out expressly for the purpose of special education.
Thank you so much. We greatly appreciate it. And I hope that everyone will visit the Department of Education's website, and they can just simply look for that on Google it for Indiana Department of Education. I hope that they'll also visit our website at nsource.org because there's wonderful resources to help community stakeholders, schools, parents at each of these websites. One more check to see if anyone had any questions. I do not see any. Everyone, thank you so much for joining office hours and IDOE today. And Brandon, thank you so much for it. We do not have office hours in December, but we will start them back again in January. So at this time, I will stop recording our meeting and wish everyone a wonderful holiday week. And thank you all very much.
Thank you.